Coach Ruth is going to be here, and Will is the person that has given you guys the strength plan that's posted on our Google Sheet. So he is an expert in the field. Ask him lots of questions because remember, we can only ask the questions when they're live. So take advantage of this time and Will's time. And thank you, Will. I'll give the floor to you.
Hey, thanks everybody for spending your Friday evening with us and learning about strength training for rowing. Questions live, yes, but I have provided my email address in a couple different ways and am happy to take questions after the fact too if they do come up. And for anybody else listening to this on recording, please feel free to email me. I've got my contact information in the last slide. So what I want to talk about today is strength training adjustments for masters rowers. And by that, I mean the adjustments that we make based on what kind of masters rower you are. When I was designing the strength training program, it was different than the camp that we did just before this with the juniors, because juniors, you get a sort of more narrow audience in terms of a 4-year window, big differences within those 4 years. But masters rowing can mean a lot of different things. And so what we're going to talk about tonight is what some of those things are, and then how we can train specifically to those factors by making some changes in our programming. Here's a little bit about me before we get going. I started my life in rowing in the top left picture as the skinny little lightweight. Rowed as a junior, mostly small boats because we were a program. Went to college there, that's top right, when I started competing in strength sports, left the lightweight categories behind. And then I ended up coming back to rowing via the weight room. I was a kinesiology major at Western Washington University and did an internship with the track and field team, I was just in the gym a lot, and I would help out the men's rowers who I knew on the team. And eventually they said, hey, why don't you come out with the rest of the team? So I started riding along with the head coach in the launch, and ended up being there for the next 6 years in different capacities, both as the strength and conditioning coach, as well as assistant coach and full-time on water after I graduated. My wife and I moved to Central Vermont last April. She got a job out here with the state, and it just so happened that we're about an hour south of the Craftsbury Sculling Center. So I go up there and guest coach as often as they'll let me. If you haven't found it already via the program materials, you also might be familiar with my work through the rowingstronger.com website, where I write about strength training for rowing. Go figure. So again, what we're doing tonight is talking about some of the benefits that strength training offers masters rowers. So if you're not already incorporating strength training in your program, I hope to give you some convincing reasons why it will benefit you and your rowing, and then how to make your own strength training adjustments. So in the stock program that you all got, the 3 different tiers for beginner, intermediate, and advanced, those are very general adjustments. They do have rowing specific elements, but we can adjust more specifically on an individual basis, whether your goals are more technique and longevity in the sport, or performance. And then performance, or we talk about sprint or distance racing. So I just have a couple things I want to get out of the way on the webinar. Due to limitations of time, this is not going to be like a ground zero sort of everything you need to know about strength training from the very beginning. So I'm assuming that you have some sort of strength training experience and access to some equipment. In the beginner program, that equipment is very minimal. But when we start talking about more specific adjustments, we are going kind of beyond the most basic body weight level. So if you're not able to get gym access, hopefully that changes here as the various reopening strategies play out. And then I'm also assuming that you're primarily strength training to improve your rowing ability. I have a little bit of a hard time once we start talking about a very general population, and we get almost more into personal training and, I want to get better as a rower, but I also want to get a bigger bench press at the gym and get my biceps bigger, and all these goals that aren't really the role of a rowing strength coach. And then as far as health goes, I am a strength coach, not a physical therapist. So during Q&A, I'm neither qualified nor insured to be talking about specific injuries and recommendations. So I'm assuming with all of this that I'm going to talk about general principles and general adaptations, but then it will be up to you to make your own specific ones if you do have injury history or specific needs. A strength training program starts with what's called a needs analysis. In a needs analysis, we identify what the specific performance factors are, who our athlete is, what their training factors are, and what they need as an athlete. So to start with the first one, what I want to go into first is what makes a good masters rower and what makes a great masters rower. So the first thing we need is fitness, because we need to be able to get up and down a race course and around in training. So if we're talking about if we're talking about 2,000 meters and more, we're really talking about aerobic system performance. There are anaerobic components, but mostly we talk about aerobic. That also helps with recovery between sessions. So I don't know many rowers who really scrimp out on their aerobic training. It tends to be much more anaerobic that rowers tend to undervalue or underestimate the impact of in training. Certainly more important if we're talking about 1,000-meter races. And as well as for 2,000 meters and up, that's the sprint and the start, and the power moves in between, the higher intensity, shorter duration outputs being more anaerobic. Research indicates that 2,000 meter race is between 77 and 88% aerobic, but a 1K race, there's no research on it, but in Rowing Faster, Ed McNeely suggests that it's up to 50 to 60% anaerobic. So if we're talking about that for our masters rower, that's a different conversation than if we're talking about 2,000 meters or if we're talking about longer distances. The next thing we need is strength. The primary goal of strength for rowing is to have enough of it so that race pace is submaximal. So if it's really, really hard for you to take a full stroke, then it's going to be really hard to do that for 1,000 meters, 2,000 meters, and beyond. So the sort of the short note on strength training is that we increase strength to decrease the relative per stroke effort to then improve endurance at sub-maximal intensities. So basically we want to increase your peak force potential so that it's relatively easier to maintain a sub-maximal force, because now that sub-maximal force is less of your total potential. So I can answer clarifying questions on that if we need some specific numbers. There's one piece of research on masters rowers and strength training specifically, and this was one that found that quadriceps muscle size, your quads and your legs, was related to 2,000 meter performance. So this was with 15 masters men aged 65 on average, with a 2K time between 8 minutes and 8:45. And they found that they compared these masters rowers against sedentary men of the same age, and they found that masters rowers had larger quadriceps muscles, and also that the quadriceps size was related to 2K performance. So that at least suggests that muscle cross-sectional area or muscle size overall confers benefits when we're talking about rowing performance. We also need great technique. Anybody who's been in a boat knows that you can be as strong, as fit as you want, and you are not moving that boat unless you actually know how to get your oar in and out of the water cleanly. So I want to note that technique is somewhat boat dependent. That another one of our variables in our needs analysis is, are you more of a single sculler with a longer force curve? Or are you a quad rower with a shorter force curve, higher peak? Some people refer to the quad as like rowing a leg press down the field, because the stroke is so short that you're really just tapping it. Whereas if you're in a single, it's more of a coast into it, broader force curve, longer time to apply force, more force required because you've got a longer time to apply it. So we've got some differences within that category too. And so I think that when we're talking about good versus great masters rowers, a great masters rower is going to have all of these things in spades. I think that we could be good masters rowers with focusing on really developing one variable and achieving adequacy with the other variable. We don't usually think about adequacy as a particularly positive thing, but if we assume that there's a limited amount of training time for all things, and we're thinking about where we're going to invest our time, are you more of the technician and you like your drills and your very refined stroke techniques? Great, let's achieve adequate strength, adequate fitness, and put a lot of time towards working technique, and you'll be able to get down a race course very well. Or are you more of the physiologist? You spend more time working fitness, more time working strength, and achieve adequate technique. you know, good enough to not hold you back in a race. I think we've seen enough examples of good rowers on both of those types. And again, great rowers are going to be that combination of great technique, great strength, great fitness, biomechanical, genetic variables, all that stuff. That's, you know, the top performers in any sport have that right combination. I want to do something. I've got a couple polls in here. I'm going to fire the first one up, which is, what is your competitive priority? So I'm going to launch the poll, and I think it gives us 60 seconds. And just pick the one that most accurately describes you. Maybe not perfectly accurately, but the one that you most identify with as far as what your competitive priority is in a normal, non-pandemic year. It is launched. And I'm going to use this information to tailor my presentation a little bit so that I'm talking about what is of interest to the majority of the group. Okay, 15 out of 15. And we do mostly both. So focusing equally on sprints and distance. That's a particular challenge for Masters rowers, because you've got Masters Nationals in August and then a very short turnaround to when fall head races start. So something to consider in our annual training plan is going to be how we manage that turnaround time from going quickly from sprint training into head race training in the fall. And that's a different calculation than if you are purely focusing on sprints and the head races, you know, whatever they happen, maybe they don't happen. Or if you purely focus on distance, then you can split out your year a little bit more. So by the way, I'm not sure if the results showed up on your screen too, but that was 53% focus equally on sprints and distance. We've got one who focuses primarily on erg racing, 3 on sprints, and 3 on distance primarily. Part of our needs analysis too is looking at some specific injury risks. We try to get as specific as possible, so we can look at rowing generally, but we can also look at the specific type of rowing that people do, whether it's sweep or scull or erg. And we can also look at our specific population too. So since this is a Masters crowd, friend and fellow rowing strength coach Joe DeLeo found one study on Masters rowers looking specifically at sports injuries. This was a study of 700 rowers at the FISA Worlds event, or at the World Championship event. So they surveyed those. So that skews our population a little bit towards like the most competitive of Masters rowers who are going to travel around the world to race in rowing. But nonetheless, that describes many people in our general audience. Both male and female, and since they're Masters, 27 and up in age. Lumbar spine was the most common injury, so that holds consistent with the rest of rowing research. And there were a few differences. One was that in age 60 and up, men experienced more injuries in sculling than they did in sweeping. The sculling versus sweeping thing is not as clear as I think a lot of people think, that sculling just sort of gives you a free pass because, oh, it's more symmetrical. But the loads on the lower body are very similar. The loads on the spine are very similar. And I've got more slides ahead on some of those biomechanical differences. But I think that's important to note, because it indicates that sculling is not just a free pass to do whatever types of training you want. There's also a migration in injuries to the upper body in the 60 and up age group for men and women. The authors speculated that it was possible that the lack, or as strength decreased, rowers started to try to get more force from the back end of the stroke. So there's a biomechanical principle called summing forces, S-U-M, summing as in adding, where if we can't get a segmented stroke anymore with a lot of pressure at the front end, crescendo in the middle, squeezing through the back end, we just start to sum forces, which is to say get them all at once and pile them up wherever we can. So that tends to happen in weaker rowers, particularly like juniors who are new to the sport. Open everything up all at once, flex the arms of the catch, get everything going, because that's the only way that they can move the system through the water. But it's possible that this happened as an age-related strength and muscle loss function as well, with the injury migration to more in the upper body. Need more research to determine that. 62% of the injuries were chronic injuries, which is to say not traumatic or acute. Chronic injuries are typically overuse injuries. So in rowing, that's just a meters and mileage management issue. And 35 to 46% of the injuries overall were incidental, which is to say minimal impact, missed no practices, or minor impact on practices. So that's just sort of your general aches and pains. And 43% of the acute injuries, so 62% of all injuries were chronic. Of the acute injuries, 43% of those were from cross training. So there's an interesting factor that they found that more activities was more linked to injury risk. So while cross training is really good and productive, we've got to be careful that it's done safely. Road biking was just found in another study to be a major risk of injuries for Team Australia. They would put them out on the bike to go get their aerobic work in, and hit a kangaroo or a pothole or whatever you run into in Australia to hurt yourself. So 43% of the acute injuries came from cross training. And so I've got this quote from a rowing injuries meta-analysis study that found that the majority of injuries are overuse injuries and largely due to an abrupt change in training volume, technical changes, or the type of boat rowed. So similar with the cross training issue, if we're changing modes really suddenly and not giving the body time to catch up, that's where some of these injuries could come in. Or for those of you who switch between sweep, scull, erg, row, bouncing back and forth quickly. So in rowing injury research, we typically find more injuries from erging, especially when athletes switch, like the change from fall into winter season, and then again in the change from winter into spring season. So that brings me to my next poll, which is I'm interested in your rowing type. So again, same rules as the first one, just the one that you most identify with of this, even if it doesn't describe you perfectly. Poll is launched. All right, 100%. You all are on it. Appreciate that. So let's see.
Close. That's a close one.
Yeah, it is. And Sarah, everybody can see this, right? It's not just me. If I hit end poll, it still stays there.
Yes, you
Okay.
can share results. Share results.
Oh, okay. Cool. So now everybody can see it. Great. So yeah, sculling or the utility player. So for the utility player, if you're jumping between boats quickly, something to be aware of, just because if you're changing the technique quickly, as well as just the different ways that skeletal structures are exposed to stroke forces. So we will come back to that in one of my future slides. The final variable of our needs analysis is personal factors. So here's where we really get wild with it in terms of masters rowing, because masters rowers can come from all different athletic backgrounds. We've got people who rowed competitively as juniors or collegiate athletes, left the sport for 10, 15 years, started a career, had a family, the sort of typical masters rower story, and then came back to the sport. We can have people from different sporting backgrounds, so endurance, power, field sports, whatever. And then we can have people with no athletic background whatsoever. So maybe you missed sports the first time around, or maybe you're from the pre-Title IX generation of women's rowers. There's a particularly strong group of 65 and up age women's rowers who didn't have the opportunity to play sports the first time around, are now discovering a whole new athletic identity. I think that's awesome. It's one of my favorite groups to coach. And so that we'll just jump straight into my next poll, and then we'll go from there. So this one's going to ask you just about what your background is, where you came from, again, what you identified with most prior to rowing. $16 of 16. Nice. So yeah, again, super balanced here. Let me end and share. So this sort of gives us a very neat cross section of masters rowing, which is 25% from mostly more rowing, 13% from mostly prior endurance sport experience, 3 of you from mostly power sport or field sports, 3 brand new to sports or very limited, and then 4 from the other. So that's fun. Like that's part of what makes masters rowing really interesting, but that's also part of what makes it challenging to just slap a training program out for, is because each of these require specific adjustments in training and strength training. If you come from a rowing background, you're going to have more rowing miles on you overall. That means that you might have greater technical proficiency, but that also means that bad habits might be more ingrained than with a rower who's starting more fresh. So that's something to be aware of. Also, even if you just have more rowing experience, that doesn't necessarily count for strength training experience. So depending on when and where you rowed, you may have strength training experience along with your rowing experience, or maybe not. Those with prior endurance sport experience, if they're transitioning into 1K sprint racing, so if you're in that overlap of people who mostly focus on sprints and people who came from a prior endurance sport, really shifting our training values to working more peak power, more strength, more on the anaerobic side, because not only is it more important due to the type of race that you're rowing, but it's also more important because it's largely neglected in the background of endurance sport athletes, and also the age-related losses in strength and power are working against you as the competitive importance of power increases. If you come from mostly power sports or mostly field sports, you might have more of the general athleticism, more of the strength base, but maybe needing more of the technical work from rowing, and maybe more of the general aerobic endurance work too. If you're brand new to sports, and especially if you're brand new to strength training, then we're really working on like filling in the gaps from basic physical education, learning how to move your body, learning how to move your body with force, and learning how to apply all that to the brand new sport of rowing. So I've seen with masters rowers who add strength training in, regardless of what their background was, if we can find that neglected quality, so particularly if they come from rowing, prior endurance sports or no sports, and then we add in strength training, we can see faster times from 50 and up than before, when it was more of a focus on rowing, because again, we're identifying where the neglected factor is, and we're starting to fill those gaps in the overall training experience. And then the other is really a wild card. I have one client right now who taught me about a whole new sport that I didn't know anything about beforehand. And I actually can't remember what it's called now, but it was like horse gymnastics. Basically, the horse trots around in a ring, going very slowly, and you do like team gymnastics on it. So all of the single leg work stuff that I throw at her is no challenge whatsoever, because her balance from doing gymnastics on a horse is just off the charts. But she's got the busted up shoulders and the other stuff that I guess comes along with that when you're doing tricks on horseback. So always learning about something new.
We actually it's sound voltage dressage.
I think dressage is the sort of
The leaping
tricks.
and everything, right?
Yeah. That's where the horse is doing more of the work.
Yep. So Felix is telling us that it's voltage. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
That may be correct. We can Google search that afterwards if we
have
time.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, we would consider in our personal factors needs analysis, personal strengths, weaknesses, injury history there too. Masters rowers with more age and experience comes more opportunities to pick up little injuries, aches and pains, or maybe you've had traumatic injuries from other sport related things or whatever in your past. So we would just take into account all of those. What can we train around? What do we need to modify? Or in the case of my client with the horsey background, what do we need to just take off the table entirely because there's too much history there and it's not worth the risk. So all those things are considered. Again, we make these considerations too for junior rowers, but they just haven't had the amount of time to rack up the broad experience that masters rowers have had. So I think it's more important for masters rowers to consider all these factors. And then what if you don't race? I think go back to previous poll, but I don't think we got many people who said that they were not interested in racing. But especially now in 2020, the year of the single sculler, there certainly are plenty of people just sculling to be able to get on the water, even if it's not their competitive priority. So if you are sculling sort of just for technique, longevity in the sport, getting out of the water, those are all great things. Some people just don't care about racing or don't care about racing anymore. You could sort of pick and choose your own goals and methods here. I mean, this is a talk about making those adjustments anyway, but from the non-competitive category, we can then be even more selective with what do I care about training right now? What's going to offer me benefit, instead of making that performance trade-off of, okay, I know I need to do this so that I can go down the race course faster. All right, here's a brief biomechanical comparison, because I found this to be insightful for some folks on previous webinars. From the side, and especially looking at the lower body here, erging, sculling, and sweeping are biomechanically similar from the hips down. So lower body forces, similar. Not identical, but certainly more similar than when we look at it from the front, where we see vastly different actions around the shoulders and at the rib cage. Given that those are two sites of injury, rib stress injuries, less common in masters rowers due to less training mileage overall. It's sort of a classic overuse injury that goes along with training level. But with that migration to more upper body injuries in the elbow, shoulder, and wrist, we'd want to consider this with masters 60 and up based on the results of the earlier study that showed that migration, and also taking into account that if we're switching between these factors, these are three very different ways that the upper body is creating movement. So I just sort of wanted to show that just to visually see how big the differences are as far as the upper body is concerned, and then to consider that our training factors, not just to be aware of for injury risk, but also for some of the strength training exercises that I'm going to talk about in our next slides. So what I'm going to do here is go through some of my go-to movements. This says strength training for scullers. I used some of this film in a previous webinar, but I'm going to pick out a few of the specific adjustments and cues that I make with masters rowers. So some of this I hope will explain some of what is in the training program too. But actually, let me pause real quick. And Sarah, are we getting any questions from the sort of needs analysis chunk before I move into the exercises?
We are still good to go, Will.
Great. So then let's get into the exercises. I found it really critical, again, thinking back to that last slide with the different shoulder actions, depending on what your primary mode of rowing is, to understand what exactly the shoulders are doing in the stroke. Because from the launch, coaches can say, shoulders down, shoulders down, shoulders down. We all know we don't want to sort of be up here with the motorcycle grip, but an actual understanding of how the shoulders move and then how we can train that in the gym, I found really helpful for athletes to connect those dots between what's going on in their body and what they're trying to do on the water. So here's just the simple shoulder movement. We're going to add the muscles into this in a moment for how we actually create movement here between the shoulder blade and the arm bone. So again, just wanted to play that and put that in your heads before we go into the YWT raise here. This is an exercise that is in the full body warm-up, as well as you'll find it in the training program. You're welcome to do it while we go if that's going to be helpful for you. And then I have all these videos available, and we'll make sure that they're available after the webinar as well. So yeah, we go from this hip hinge position, and the whole focus of the YWT raise is keeping these shoulders back and down. So I'm always cueing shoulders in the back pockets when we do this. We're just making the letters Y, W, and T, just like the song with some different lyrics. So now I'm doing the W raise. Again, cueing shoulders back and down, really trying to get into those mid-back muscles that may lie dormant during long hours on the computer. And then here's the T raise. Again, thinking shoulders back and down. So the reason that that's crucial, especially for those of you who are sculling, but it applies as well in sweeping and erging, is that if we don't have those mid-back muscles strong, activated, under conscious control, as in we can flex them and move them when we want to, it's going to be really hard when we're in the boat to achieve that nice shoulders down, maybe some slight protraction or shoulder forward movement. That's fine as we come into the catch. But a powerful connection from the foot plate to the torso, to the shoulder girdle, and then to the handle, whether that's the handles of sculling oars, sweeping oars, or the erg handle. So here are a couple of errors that basically just happen around the shoulders coming up and forward instead. And one of the hardest athletes who I've ever coached on this at Craftsbury was a dentist. And if we think about that from a workplace ergonomics angle, always spending time in this forward rounded position, working over patients' faces, we can understand why we need to do some extra work on those little mid-back muscles to avoid that shoulders up and forward position. So I found the YWT raise really crucial for activation and basically physical education, learning how to access those muscles, because then these play in with all of the other exercises that we're going to do from the pulling category of our lifts. And I spent a lot of time working on pulling strength in general. And so what I'm going to go through here is some of those different exercise modifications and just sort of the specific high points. Okay, so once we've got control, yeah.
Any particular reason for the direction of the thumb for each?
Yes. Because as we were taught in undergrad, rhomboids are rad. That was how we were taught always to remember that when you have your thumbs up, that's more activation for the rhomboids muscle in the mid-back. Basically, what it does is keeping the thumbs up through the exercise helps keep the shoulder in that back and down position. And again, that's one that you can feel yourself. I find it really helpful to teach this wrong in order to teach it right. So go into the top of the T position and point your thumbs down and see what that does to your shoulders, and then point your thumbs up towards the sky and then feel what that does to your shoulders. So we can sort of roll the shoulder around in its joint that way.
Great. And then one follow-up. We have a couple questions popping up that one of them I want to save to the end because it kind of is a general topic, but why this one applies to now. Why do you do these exercises standing?
We can do them from a bench or from a stability ball as well. I do like to do them standing because it gives us an extra opportunity to talk about the hip hinge, which is going to be one of our other movement categories that we're basically building up the low intensity endurance from the hip hinge position. Fundamentally, I don't use a lot of machines or isolation exercises in my rowing training programs because rowing is very much not a machine supported or isolation exercise sport. So for athletes who need to be able to transfer force through the long kinetic chain of the rowing stroke from feet all the way through all the joints to the hands, I think the more opportunities that we could teach that in the full body system, the more effectively that's going to transfer. But I will regress it to working on a bench or a stability ball for athletes who either struggle with the movement and really need that extra focused environment, or for athletes who do have like a low back concern or something where we do want to be really careful about the amount of volume on the lower body.
Great. Thank you. Go ahead. Keep going.
Cool. Well, so once we've got control of the shoulder muscles through the YWT raise, that's sort of the prerequisite teaching exercise. Then we can go into the training for the shoulder muscles. So here I'm demonstrating the band pull apart. I'm just going to show errors on here too. I'm not going to do errors for every single exercise, but just for the early ones, really getting the feel that when the shoulders come up first, that's when bad things start to happen. So we want to be training this with shoulders in this. There's the up and then the back and down position. The face pull is another one where now we're getting into some external rotation of the shoulder muscles too in a way that we can't get from rowing. But we're still training the general shoulder rhythm of keeping the shoulder blade down while the arm bone moves around it. One of my favorites, the X band row we do from this half kneeling position. This gives us a really good opportunity to teach and ingrain those good shoulder movements. I do show errors on this one because I often see them with rowers where they let that shoulder start to kick up. So this is an opportunity to basically like refine our pull through at the end of the drive. As you can see there, how the shoulder coming up first kicks my elbows out to the side, screws my mechanics all up. So this is where we can sort of get into that intersection of strength, technique, motor pattern, movement control. Here's another band exercise. I know I've used a lot of bands in here because I know there's something people have access to now thanks to the gym shutdown situations. There are other options as well. But here's again one where we're training the squeeze and hold effect of the hand that's holding it at the top while we train the movement of the other. So we can sort of train stability in one while we get the movement of the other. And then here's a modification for the dumbbell row that I do often use with masters rowers. I am careful to keep load off of the low back in general. There are times when I want the full body system trained, like in the YWT race, and there are other times where it's either just too much across a whole training program or it's too much within one specific exercise. The YWT race, there's very little load involved, but when we get into one-arm rowing variations, it is possible for rowers to be using anywhere up to 100 pounds, and that can pile up on the lower back. So here's a way that I modify the dumbbell row to basically stand straddle over the bench instead of to the side, and that eliminates the low back rotating at the bottom. So that's not so much of a specific modification based on competitive type, but just based on age and the knowledge that the lumbar spine is still the biggest injury risk for masters rowers. Just an easy change out to focus on the goal of that exercise. Let me go back to rows real quick because I want to mention two exercises that were notably absent from that. I do not use bench pulls. And I really don't use barbell rows either, like the bent over barbell row, for the same reason for the barbell row of too much low back emphasis. That tends to just turn into more round back pulling that isn't actually targeting the muscles of the back that we want to target. And it is adding more load on the lumbar spine. It's not doing much for stroke mechanics either. So I tend to pick any one of the other exercises that I just showed rather than the barbell row. And for the bench pull, I don't like the bench pull for a lot of reasons. I could rant about this for a little while. I spend enough time coaching rowers to not break the arms first, that what I want is an engagement of the back muscles into the arms, not prone, supported by a bench in a way that's totally unrealistic to the sport of rowing, bending the arms first. So technical interference there, as well as from a strength training standpoint, it's kind of an isolation exercise because we're not using the whole body in the system, but it's overloading the body at the same time because we do a lot of reps and a lot of weight with it. So it's just sort of a neither here nor there exercise for me. And I'm demonstrating the band pull down here because I really don't use the unassisted chin up much either. I find that rowers, particularly the long limbed ones, really struggle with it, and that it's not worth the problems that can come about from doing the exercise incorrectly. So with the band pull down, we're working the same idea of, hold on, let me go back and show that again. We're working the same idea of the shoulder coordination, but just in the vertical plane instead of in the horizontal plane. So in the error section, I'm going to show what the same thing that happens when the shoulders come up first. We get into this motorcycle position. Whereas what we want, whether we're sculling, sweeping, or erging, is shoulders in that down position. So strength training is a huge opportunity to gain movement fluency in all those different movement patterns, as well as improve the specific strength of the muscles that we want to be using when we get back on the water. Let me go into the push section. I quite like the push-up because it allows the shoulder blades to move more freely than when they're pinned against a bench in a bench press sort of exercise. So that's why you'll see plenty of push-ups in the training program. Push-up, I'll start with a sort of obvious statement here that a push is just a pull in reverse. So all the same errors that can happen on a pull as far as the shoulder is concerned can all happen on a push too. So here you'll see that the shoulders are coming up first, kicks the elbows out, or just a lack of torso tightness here. So if you cannot correct those errors, rather than doing push-ups from the knees or struggling through max effort sets of 3 on push-ups, I found it much more valuable to raise the height to give you the mechanical advantage, make the push-up easier, do more reps, and gradually lower the height over time. So in the training programs, you'll see elevated push-up as an option with push-up. That allows us to get more reps. We're still working equally as hard because we're actually able to do reps here. And then the ladder push-up is another variation of this. So once the athlete is able to do some from the floor, but not achieve the full number of reps, we can go to the ladder push-up, get some of our reps in on the floor, move up to an intermediary height. You gain some mechanical advantage, lets you get some more reps in your set, and then go up to our next height. So here I've basically just done a set of 9 or 10, but at 3 different heights. We could progress this a bunch of different ways, but I just wanted to provide the option for that. There's more ways to get benefit from the push-up, but I really like to see rowers maximize the benefit from the push-up before moving into loaded presses. Also particularly beneficial if you don't have access to equipment. More ways to find improvement. The alternating dumbbell press is one of my favorites because then we're training that shoulder stability in the offhand while we work the movement of the other hand. And it also has the effect of keeping the weight down a little bit. So anytime that we can keep the weight down and increase the effectiveness of the exercise, I'm all for it because we're just reducing cumulative stress in favor of applying a specific muscular stimulus. So again, this is not a comprehensive look at all exercises that I use, but just a few that I wanted to highlight for the purposes of the webinar. Half kneeling overhead press is one. Again, now we're training same as the chin up was for the rows. The overhead press is for the push-ups. So same shoulder movements, just in the vertical plane instead of in the horizontal plane. And the same errors can happen. So you see the shoulder kicking up first, pushes the dumbbell out in front. Shoulder moves before the arm. Bad things happen. I just wanted to emphasize that a very consistent thing across my coaching is learning how to control the shoulder through all of its movements. And then I really don't use barbells much for pressing. I'll favor a dumbbell or a kettlebell just about any time because it lets us train more shoulder stability in more of a focused way, moving the whole body to one dumbbell instead of spreading that across the both hands in the barbell. I also find that athletes it's an easier exercise to do correctly so they can get more out of it. But I like the push press because now we're getting back into that generating force at the foot, pushing through the connected torso into the implement held in the hand. And then some errors here that tend to happen just either from using too much weight or from just incorrect sequencing. Here, this is really far forward on the balls of my feet. Back to that. Is a common error, just sort of ineffective leg drive. So we really want to get that snappy drive balanced from the front of the foot and the back of the foot. Right. I've got the body weight squat variations that I just wanted to mention. Those are in the exercise index, so I'll let you poke through those if you're one of the either don't have equipment or you can still get challenge out of body weight exercises. Great. There are different ways to do that. Here I'm going to focus more on the loaded exercises. So here's the goblet squat. Great exercise for regaining that lower body force, particularly important for the front end of the stroke. Good for performance. Good for reducing injuries by keeping more force off the upper body. So I think it's really important that rowers are doing some sort of squat, although the exact type of squat depends again on that needs analysis. Where is your training experience? Are there any injury factors that we need to be aware of? But the goblet squat is one that we can get a lot of value out of. Here I'm showing sort of the typical rower squat. It's often sequenced very similarly to the stroke of pushing with the legs and then pulling through with the back. So that's just one that I see happen. Oh, I can't get around to that. The barbell front squat is my preference compared to the back squat. loads the anterior a little bit more, works the torso muscles a little bit more than the back squat. We can also use the cross grip. I find that this tends to be more comfortable for rowers than the clean grip with the bars here. I just wanted to show here that our lower body positions are the same, whether we're using the dumbbell and the goblet squat or whether we're using the barbell in the front squat. I swear there's no Photoshop trickery there. I went down to the bottom of one and then to the bottom of the other and took a freeze frame of both. So we want those to look like very similar movements, just with a different in position. One of my adjustments for masters rowers is sometimes restricting range of motion. Now, I'm hesitant to just say squat high because it's really not an answer. If you do need to restrict your range of motion because of an injury concern, the way that I would prefer to do it is by marking your effective range of motion with a band like this, rather than using a bench, which then sort of facilitates like a flop down effect, or just kind of arbitrarily squatting to whatever depth you'd like to. So you can set that up in a bunch of different ways, but I found this to be just let's set the range of motion where it's comfortable to, and then either work to gradually progress the range of motion or at least keep that consistent while we add load or reps. I'm gonna skip through some of these. I did want to show one that I like is the lateral step up, but I find that there are some common errors on this. I really use this as a single leg hip stability exercise and getting into the frontal plane too. So we're working single leg hip stability. All right, hold on one second. With the lateral hip emphasis. So since rowers are so forward and backward, whether it's on the erg or on the water, any movements that get us moving more laterally or stabilizing more laterally can be beneficial towards just maintaining overall athleticism. We can also do it from the front, but I wanted to show errors here from the lateral is basically when we lose the hip stability effect.
Will, this is great because we actually went through some of these movements with Coach Swisher.
Awesome. Great. So here's just simply too bouncy. So what I do find that people do wrong is they use way too high of a step height. So here I'm using a pretty low one because I'm really focusing on hip stability. This is obviously too high. So this is not doing anything for our stroke technique. And it's also excess loading on the lower body skeletal structures, knees, hips, and spine. So I find that a lot of our masters rower sort of injury problems are often not self-created, but can be solved with better exercise selection, really focusing on what is our goal of this exercise and training to that goal rather than just sort of using as much weight or load as possible. With the hip hinge, I just wanted to go generally over this. I don't know if this was one of the ones that Dr. Swisher's covered too, but I find that it's particularly beneficial to teach the hip hinge the same way that we teach the YWT raise in terms of just a general sporting movement. Again, depending on your background, the hip hinge is sort of the universal sport skill, but if you come from cycling or something where it's less of a dynamic task, or from no sporting background whatsoever, it's possible that you miss this. So there's just a couple ways to get to the hip hinge, which is moving the hips and the spine together, not just turning it into a squat or just a forward bend, but finding that midpoint between the two. This is the same motion that we use getting out of the bow on the recovery to do good recovery sequencing, as well as how we create power on the drive. So really important that we could do this in the weight room too, to reinforce those skills, as well as a prerequisite to moving on to all the other exercises in the general deadlift category. So I just want to show a couple of these here. I'm going to move, hold on. I do use the kettlebell Romanian deadlift with a lot of rowers, but particularly masters rowers, because if we can get a good amount of loading in through here, through a good movement pattern, way more valuable to me than loading up a barbell and trying to do a bunch of deadlifts. So we could do this with the dumbbell, kettlebell, or barbell. I'm going to skip into, hold on, the elevated depth, YouTube, sorry. The elevated barbell deadlift is one that I use frequently. Again, range of motion reducing, um, and particularly for rowers who are 6'2" and up. The deadlift starts at an arbitrary height, so there's no real reason that we need to start the deadlift from the floor at the 9.5 inches set plate width. We can elevate it. And so I'll just set the rower at wherever they can maintain a good hip hinge technique, and that is their deadlift height. And it's all the same mechanics as the rest of the hinge. And I'm using plates here, but you could use little rubber pavers or concrete blocks or wood blocks if your gym has those. I find this is just a good way to, again, like focus on what's the goal of our hinging exercise, teaching the hip hinge, training the posterior chain muscles of the hamstrings and glutes and low back to become better rowers, not necessarily to become better deadlifters. I also really like the hex bar or the trap bar if you have access to one of these. This again gets more stress off the low back, lets us focus more on generating power from the floor, building general force potential to carry over to rowing. And then same thing, we use high handles with taller athletes or athletes who have range of motion restrictions. And then I've got a few in here from the everything else category. There's one core exercise that I wanted to highlight in particular, which is the seated rock back. What I'm working here is basically our actions around the release. So this is the back end of the rowing stroke. What I'm doing is I'm keeping pressure through my heels, which engages the hip extensors or the glute muscles and reduces contribution from the hip flexors. So this really focuses on the abdominal muscles to create this movement, not relying on co-contraction from the hip flexors. I've seen athletes who could do planks for 2 or 3 minutes, really, really struggle. They think they have a super strong core, and they really, really struggle when you put them in the seated rock back exercise, because now we're focusing just on the torso tightness with movement at the hips. So I've done this a bunch of different ways. You can do it with the hands out in front of you to tie in the shoulder skills and get a little bit more specific to rowing. It's also a little bit easier because the hands are some counterbalance. And then I've also done it as just an isometric, so you can just rock back to your 11 o'clock layback position and hold that for time. So that's a good way to just build up basic endurance. Again, heel pressure the whole time, really crucial element on that. And then I do want to be cautious on time. So I want to skip through the carries and the band walks, because those are, again, all these videos would be available to you on replay, and they're also in the exercise index. So yeah, let's leave that for there and get into more of the programming side of things.
Will, I have a quick question.
Yeah, let's do exercise questions before I move on.
What about on a ball using bands to resist the rock?
On a stability ball, yes. Using bands to resist the rock, I've not done.
Okay.
I think that if you can do that while really being intentional about maintaining heel pressure, then more power to you. Where I tend to go in progression with that exercise is not adding load, but adding time and reps, because there we are building up more specific muscle endurance. And we're doing it from a more, not necessarily sports specific, but it's facilitating our same goals as we're going to have in rowing.
Sure.
Yeah. So I like to build up to 60 seconds of rock back for about 3 sets. So
okay.
I find that if athletes can do that, then their cores are strong enough for rowing, because the anterior abdominals don't contribute that much to the stroke. There's research on this that we can get into, but basically the anterior abdominals only are maximally active during as the torso slows down into the release. So once the body passes mid-drive, slowing down to get the blade out of the water and then reversing into the recovery. That's where the anterior abdominals are most active. It's not at the front end of the stroke where people sort of think, oh yeah, like a plank, everything tight. Abdominals are very minimally active at the front end of the stroke. So I try to get rowers more out of thinking about core and into thinking about the body as a system and that we want to be training power generation from the feet through the whole body whenever possible, because that's ultimately what we have to do in rowing.
Perfect. And like I said, we have a couple more questions. I'm going to hold them till the end because they're kind of general questions
Perfect.
for you.
Yeah, perfect. I've just got a couple programming snapshots here, just emphasizing that the A's and the B's tend to be our main work exercises. So there we're working more strength and power, looking for that to carry over to more rowing performance. The C and the D exercises tend to be more of the muscular emphasis exercises, and also tend to be working things that we don't get in rowing anyway. So we're always riding that balance in strength training for all rowers, but especially masters rowers, of working the sport specific, building force potential for rowing elements, as well as working the how can we use strength training to fill the gaps that we're not getting from rowing or from other places in our lives. So just wanted to emphasize those two things as far as programming core concepts, and what I said earlier about the 20 to 30 minute core circuit. I'm not sure has that much value, again, because thinking about what the core actually does in the stroke, if we're doing that much core and we're not doing a proportional amount of other full body exercise, I'm not sure that we're really becoming better rowers quite so much, because we need to be able to generate power from the foot plate through the whole kinetic chain, not just have a really strong transfer point. Few adjustments. Again, happy to take more specific questions on this in the Q&A too. Where we're talking about 1K and 2K sprints, we're talking about more important sides of power production. Again, I mentioned earlier that a 2K up to 85, 88% aerobic, but a 1K more like 50 to 60% anaerobic. Also, that depends on who you are as a rower, both what age you are, whether you're male or female, and what type of boat that you row. So I've got here on the left is the men's AA, so 27 age group, quads, who got down the course in just over 3 minutes, and then the men's open K, which is 85 and up, single, which is 453, 501, and 611. So these races are going to have different energy system profiles, because just like our 2K is more aerobic than our 1K, our 3-minute 1K is more anaerobic, less aerobic than our 4, 5, or 6-minute 1K. So think about duration of race more than distance of race, and think about how long you are actually going down the race course in terms of how you dial in your energy system training. And then a specific point on tapering is that we'll get more out of it for those shorter duration efforts that are more peak power, more strength dependent, relatively less influence of tapering where we start getting into distance and head racing here, where there's less anaerobic contribution. Again, the duration is so much longer that our anaerobic contribution is relatively less, and therefore we get less out of tapering. So even for athletes who are doing like head of the Charles and that's their peak, usually that's like a 10-day taper tops. So we'll start to drop the volume down in the 2 weeks away from the race, and then we'll drop the intensity down and the volume in the final week. But really not much more emphasis than that. We're just making sure that the athletes are able to display their full fitness, that they're not fatigued when they're racing. But we're not so worried as we are with 1Ks about really trying to boost the power coming into the race. So one more consideration on distance and head racing is that if your rowing training is higher volume, because if you're racing longer distances, typically you'd also train with longer distances, then the strength training should be lower volume, because we're working that training balance of how much can we recover from. Are we pushing more on the rowing training? Yes. Longer meters, longer miles, more time. Okay, then our strength training is going to be relatively lower volume to make room for that. And I wanted to give a nod to coastal, because that's another growing element. Coastal has a bunch of different factors. One is that the races can really vary in terms of length, whether you're talking about FISA coastal with the beach sprints and the buoy turns, all that stuff, or whether you're talking about like really long distance open water sorts of racing. So that's another consideration. similar calculation to the distance racing, where if we're doing really high volume rowing training, then we're going to do lower volume strength training just to make sure that we have room to recover and are focusing on important factors for performance. But we'll also consider with coastal racing that athletes are pulling around an extra, 47 pounds per stroke, because the FISA weight limit, or the minimum weight for a flat water single, is like 30 pounds, but the minimum weight for a coastal single is like 77 pounds. So that hugely changes the demands on the athlete as well. So I want to consider that too. And so that's my hour. I've got an extra slide here of these things, which I was going to use if we didn't have enough time. So we can come back to those after questions, or we can address some of these within the questions. Basically, just I want to know what you wanted to hear more about. So if there's anything in there that you're like, huh, that's interesting, I want to hear more about that, you could drop that in the chat.
Sure.
Or we can start taking questions too.
Yeah. So I'm going to backtrack to one of the earlier questions.
Yeah.
But again, general question. So one of our presenters, unnamed presenter, I will leave it unnamed, stated that strength can be better maintained in conjunction with high intensity training rather than more long distance training. This person also indicated that research has shown high intensity training can lead to the same fitness benefits as longer distance training. Any thoughts on this, and any resources for high intensity on the water training as opposed to erging to complement strength training?
I'm going to defer a little bit to focus on the strength training side.
Yeah.
And not quite get into the rowing training side.
Yeah.
So I'll take the strength coach defense there and focus my side of things on what we're doing in the weight room, and working to complement whatever the rowing programming or whatever the rowing training is doing. That whatever the rowing coach is, or whatever the rower is, has their own philosophy of how to elicit maximum performance, and it's my job as a strength coach to find where I can contribute to that. As far as whether there's more duration or shorter duration benefits for rowing performance, separate issue. Strength training, I'm always going to be working to build capacity for rowing performance, increasing force potential so that rowing is proportionately easier, less effort to move your submaximal stroke through the water, and also filling in the gaps that rowing, if we're only rowing, the gaps that creates. So there's always different movements that we can use strength training to do, rather than just doubling down on the rowing stimulus.
Great. What do you think about pull-ups, kettlebell swings, and box jumps? And how many times a week should we be lifting, and for how long?
Yeah, good questions. I'll answer in reverse order a little bit. The vast majority of my training for rowers is twice a week, full body sessions. I have tried, even with collegiate male athletes, you would think you just throw whatever at them and they'll grow, to go up to 3 times a week. And when we consider the rowing workload with that, it's almost always been too much. So, and I've worked with a lot of masters rowers too. People will say, no, I really want to do 3 days a week. And we always end up scaling it back down to 2 days a week in the long run, once more intensive rowing training starts. So I think that we really got to consider the volume of training that athletes are doing in an intense, full body, higher load sport like rowing. So twice a week full body is what I've built the training program around that you've gotten through this camp. And that's very representative of the kind of training that I do in general. The only times when I do go up to 3 times a week is with athletes who are in the off season, as in they're willing to scale back their erging and rowing training to focus on developing strength or muscle mass, because they've determined that that's a limiting factor for them. So again, coming back to the needs analysis there, as far as like what's our critical factor for the athlete. And then as far as the exercises go, pull-ups, not as much of a fan, just because I find that most rowers don't do them correctly. The shoulder motion starts to go in the wrong direction with the kick up and then the pull through. So I much prefer, where can we train good shoulder motion, and then develop strength around that. Kettlebell swings, big fan. Generally what I look for on the Hinge is, can we do the movement well, first and foremost? Then can we develop strength in that movement? So exercises like the Romanian deadlift or the hinge exercises that I showed earlier, then can we develop power in that movement? So that might be the kettlebell swing, that might be a more explosive Romanian deadlift or barbell deadlift or hex bar deadlift. But that's the general idea: is move, then develop strength, then develop power. So the kettlebell swing would be more on the power side of that. And then plyos really depends on the athlete. So we don't do plyos on concrete floors. So if you're stuck in a boathouse and that's the only jumping surface you have, totally not worth it due to the lower leg injury risk. If you have a soft top plyo box or mats or gym flooring or something that you can soften your landing on, then I think there are variations that we can use that offer benefit. I'm not sure that plyometric power has that much value for rowing performance, though, just because the stroke is relatively slow compared to the very reactive power movements that plyo training is originally designed for. So when we look at like how long it takes force generation in the rowing stroke, it's just a much longer force curve than it is in those really fast turnover field and power sports.
Great. Um, one of our athletes says that she misses using lat pull down machines. Anything for lats if we don't have a pull up bar?
Yeah, if you don't have a pull-up bar, I mean, the resistance bands are really great, and I know those were in short supply early in the shutdown, but I've seen those start to come back into stock in some places. Almost always one of my first recommendations for boat houses to buy because they're affordable, portable. You can take them with you wherever it is you're going. So I really like to use a lot of resistance bands exercises. Um, yeah, as far as
Any particular brands that you find that are pretty durable to invest in?
yeah, the two that I've had the most luck with are from Rogue Fitness as well as from Elite FTS. And I have no commercial arrangement with either of those companies. I sort of wish I did because I use a lot of resistance bands. But those are just the ones that I found to be most durable. I've tried to buy the cheap ones before, and they've always ended up fraying or splintering on me after a relatively low amount of use.
Fantastic. Next question. Any difference between the trap bar and dumbbells in each hand for your lifts?
Yes. So the trap bar again is the hex bar, trap bar, same thing. They go around the athlete and the stand in the middle of it with the side handles for deadlifting. What I've found with dumbbells is one, they can bang into your legs when you stand up with them, which is sort of then I find that people can like pull them away from themselves when they stand up, which is then not as much of a hinge exercise as we want it to be. Um, and then also often it's just too low because dumbbells sit so much lower to the ground than a hex bar does with plates. So if you could prop the dumbbells up on something, then I think you're getting many of the similar benefits. But we just got to be really careful about the range of motion and make sure that athletes are doing good hinge movements and then adding the right amount of loading onto the good movement rather than sort of starting by chasing the loading.
Great. And then our looks like our last question right now, maybe another one pops up, but if we're talking about training the body as a system and making a plan, how do you suggest tracking strength training and outcomes?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that comes up a lot. Especially rowers tend to be more analytical, more small progress minded. I think it's tough to look at strength training, weight moved, or reps performed as a direct indicator because it's so influenced by what's going on in other training. So I mean, we know that like if we have an easy day rowing or erging, we're going to do better at our strength training later that day or the next day or whatever, rather than if we go do 10 250s the morning of and then try to go do squats and deadlifts. The last thing that I want though is for an athlete to say, no, I'm going to hold back a little bit on my rowing today because I really want to hit a big deadlift later. It's like, well, now we're not training to be better rowers. We're training to be better lifters. One solution that I found is to use a 7-stroke max erg test. And Sarah, I know you've heard this before because we talked about it in the last the juniors webinar, but the 7-stroke max is a shorter duration, so we're getting more directly at the strength training adaptations that we're looking for, and it's more specific too because we're on the erg instead of layers different with squats or deadlifts. So testing a 7-stroke max, you can do 3 trials, take the average or take the best of whatever it is that's consistent. Full range of motion. It's got to be good technique. Keep the stroke as similar as possible, and test that every 4 to 6 weeks and see if you improve there. Looking at the sort of end result of the strength training adaptations. And then the other thing is to keep a training log and do look for long-term improvement in your strength training, because over time that should go up. It just might not go up as directly or as quickly as you think it, as you might want it to, or as it might if you were just focusing on the lifting side of it and not also doing all of the rowing training.
Fantastic. What stroke rate would you recommend for the test? And I'm also going to add, what drag do you put it on? I think I know your answers, but just for the crowd.
Yep. Drag, I like to keep it consistent. So whatever you typically train at. But again, if you do it one way for the first test, just keep doing it that way. So that way you're actually testing. You have a consistent baseline to test from. I've done these open rate as well, but making sure that we're keeping full stroke length. So it's only 7 strokes. You can't get up that much if you're still keeping full stroke length. But what I don't want to see is athletes like training to the test and really shortcutting stroke range of motion, just to try to get a better 7-stroke score.
Yes, that seems to be a common one. As soon as you say the rate cap comes off, or if you say the rate cap is 40.
So I mean, in the studies that they've done, they've actually had like full range marked, and athletes have to hit that every time, and they won't count the trial if the athlete shortcuts it on strokes. So if that's how you have to keep yourself accountable, go for it.
Great. And we had one last question. We'll make this the last question. At what age do you expect that you would start maintaining strength and power, and you've kind of reached your plateau? I believe that's kind of the question we're asking.
Yeah, I think that's tough too, because there's so many other training factors playing into that answer. There's obviously the genetic factors. There is going to be a point where like further gains in maximal strength or power are not achievable. But that's where I think, again, we can look at the rowing side of it and think, well, okay, even if I'm not moving more weight objectively on a deadlift, how's my rowing? So we're always looking at that, like, what actually is the goal of our training here? And if it's to get better at rowing, then I think that we can always find a way to use strength training to make small improvements in rowing, or at least, again, at a certain point. I don't know exactly when that certain point is. Holding even in your rowing performance can also become a goal. So I think it just depends on like how we're using strength training to facilitate those goals in rowing.